If you're here because you saw that this talk was called How to Feel Better While the World Ends, and you thought to yourself, yeah, I would very much like to feel better about the fact that this island is sinking, and 2023 was the hottest year on record, and some days my air quality app just advises me to stay inside, then I'm here to disappoint you. Because a truer title for this talk is How to Feel Better About Feeling Bad While the World Ends. And I am sort of sorry for tricking you, but I'm really glad that you're here. The prevalent logic seems to be that not discussing the things that disturb us most, not thinking about them, equals feeling less bad. And I am here to disagree. I've been writing about this kind of thing for going on 3 novels now. 2 that I published, 1 that I'm still working on, and I promise I didn't set out to be such a downer. It was sort of an accident. It wasn't until kind of recently that I realized I'm on such a hot little trilogy streak about the end of civilization. So while this wasn't necessarily a career path that I envisioned for myself, it is the one that has unfolded in front of me. And if there's anything I know about writing, it's that when a path rises up to meet you, that's the one you take. I'm hopeful that after I finish this next book, I will go somewhere a little gentler, but for now, I'm racking up the world-ending novels one by one. That said, each book has been very different. In some ways, this theme of apocalypse is one of the only things they have in common. It struck me while I was working on my current manuscript that I've been preoccupied with this whiff of doom in the air for quite a long time now. I think I started working on my first novel a decade ago. That's 10 years ruminating on widespread catastrophes and the characters who must endure them. 10 years feeling into how scary it is to be alive right now. And if you're thinking, wow, this woman is a living, breathing, wet blanket, you're not wrong. I'm really not fun at all. Don't even bother inviting me to your parties. But it is interesting, isn't it, though, how scary everything feels right now, how catastrophic it all seems. It's really no wonder that the apocalyptic and dystopian storytelling of this era is so rich. Not new, just thriving. Because let me be clear, the idea of the end of the world is not a hot take. It's not a recent invention. It predates the Bible. For as long as we've been telling stories, we've been telling 2 kinds, creation and destruction. The first people of this planet inherently understood that life does not exist without death. Beginnings and endings are bound together. They always have been and they always will be, no matter what the billionaire biohackers are up to these days. There's nothing more certain than the uncertainty of death, and that is something we have basically known forever. Cryogenics be damned. So why does all of this feel so immediate, so charged? What's changed? On the one hand, we have the nuclear option, right? The sudden, could happen at any moment kind of demise. In 1945, human hands opened the doorway to our own collective ending, and we became capable of wreaking the kind of conflict that our ancestors used to think only gods could inflict. And then on the other hand, we have the climate catastrophe, the slow, grinding march of a gruesomely gradual collapse. The kind of apocalypse that doesn't blossom at the push of a red button, but rather the kind that has been engulfing us so slowly we are blithely willing to ignore it until it's too late. So here we are in the middle, right? Hemmed in on both sides of this timeline. Either quickly or slowly, suddenly or gradually, this vice of our own making is contracting year after year. Of course, this has seeped into the stories we tell. Narrative is, and has always been, how we seek to understand our own mortality. This is how we examine the foundational conditions of being human. When my first novel came out in 2016, I spent a fair amount of time talking about this cultural lean toward post-apocalyptic fiction. Good Morning Midnight was the name of the book, and it imagined a sudden and unexplained catastrophe. It explored the idea of an ambiguous, world-ending event through the vantage point of characters who were experiencing it in extreme isolation. Astronauts stranded in space, an astronomer left behind at an Arctic observatory, people who had no idea what the hell was going on, but who had to come to terms with the fact that they were abruptly alone, that something terrible had happened to everyone else, and they would likely never know what it was. I was interested in setting aside the specifics of what had happened to the rest of the population, to very intentionally leave it unknowable in order to zoom in on something else. I wanted to look at the psychological experiences of individuals in the face of something I could not possibly imagine and yet was imagining all the time. Because while the facts of how and why are certainly compelling, I was and am primarily interested in the feelings. What does it feel like to bear witness? What do we do when there's nothing left to be done? I remember talking to a professor of creative writing a little while before that book came out. He was not aware of its subject matter and was speaking very freely to me about how annoying he found this recent rash of post-apocalyptic and dystopian fiction. How unimaginative it had all become. He went on and on and on, as men sometimes must do, I understand, about what a gimmick these books are, how tired a writer had to be to submit to the literary trend of the day. And if you're rolling your eyes as hard as I am, perhaps it's because you've noticed that an apocalypse is unfolding before our eyes, the slow kind. And perhaps you feel that we are already living in a dystopia, the scary kind. He said this to me in 2015. Do you remember 2015? I have to wonder what he would say now. The farther into the 21st century we get, the more likely, the more imminent the idea of an apocalypse actually feels. And I should offer the caveat that I'm not trying to start a genre war here. If you like realism best, that is absolutely fine. I like it too. But to imagine that realism and reality are the same is silly. To imagine that speculative fiction is a newfangled trend is equally silly. Storytelling has always utilized speculative elements in order to drive at the truth. And so perhaps it behooves us to be a little more inquisitive about literary trends. Perhaps they are showing us something important about our time. The world is a big place, and while generalizations about a population this big are not really my thing, I'm going to take the leap and say that I think we are all feeling the proximity of doom. Not just us here at this seminar, or us in Florida, or us in the US, all of us as a species. And this is not about politics, and it's not even about science, although both of those things are very meaningful and important. But I'm talking about something much more subterranean. I think that as a collective entity, Human beings are experiencing a deep and overwhelming fear about where we're headed. Unfortunately, and very predictably, we don't all agree on the source of this fear or what to do about it, and that is its own very mighty challenge. But I do believe the experience itself is widespread, something we all share, whether we choose to look at it head on or not. I, of course, have gotten quite granular in the act of looking. I've spent years looking, and not just looking, but befriending and imagining and shaping, because I'm not only interested in what's here, I'm interested in what is next, in cause and effect, in facts, but also in feelings. Although I write speculative fiction, I tend toward a very grounded variety. I take my liberties, of course, but I am always trying to create an alternate reality that really does feel like it could just be an extension of our own. After Good Morning Midnight came out, I began to feel that the most outrageous thing about the novel was its depiction of the Arctic as a place that in the future would still be icebound and forever frozen. Mind you, this is a book with a trip to Jupiter's moons in it, but no, it was the duration of the Arctic Circle's permafrost that really began to gnaw at me as deeply improbable. The suddenness of a lights-out, game-over nuclear apocalypse was beginning to feel less and less true to me. The more my thoughts drifted toward climate change, the more it seemed like a different kind of catastrophe lay in store for us. My imagination began to skew away from the sudden demise and toward a very slow one. A process of annihilation that is, of course, already very much underway. That has been underway for quite some time. So I started working on The Light Pirate in 2016, which is my most recent novel and the reason I was invited here. I wanted to set it in an American frontline community that would be among the first of this continent to reckon with the rising sea level and the climbing temperatures, and so I chose the coast of southern Florida, and I invented a small town called Rudder. I knew I wanted the book to open with a hurricane. I'd had an experience here in Key West that planted the seed. In late September 2016, I was doing a writing residency at the studios of Key West when Hurricane Matthew wrought havoc on Haiti. And I remember obsessively watching its approach with a sense of awe. As a visitor, I had a sort of deer in the headlights response to it, this feeling of paralysis that came over me. But all around, I saw this little island community swinging into actions of preparation. You all knew what to do. You'd been through it before, and you knew you'd go through it again. Matthew didn't hit here in the end, but it did a whole lot of damage elsewhere. And I carried that wait-and-see tension back up the coast to New Smyrna Beach, where I have family, and then on to Orlando, where I was doing another residency at the Kerouac House. And the seed of this hurricane book grew bigger the longer I spent in Florida. I started thinking a lot about how time would function in the narrative, about the ecology of past and present and future, about incorporating both the quickness of a changing climate and also its slow march. World events provided a crash course in that duality. Maria hit Puerto Rico in September 2017 and showed us the sudden destruction of the storm itself and then the long, grueling process to rebuild. In 2018, we got reports from the IPCC and the National Climate Assessment, which cemented the idea that we should all be very, very scared of the temperature rising 2 degrees. 2 degrees? The concept of the catastrophically gradual progression of little measurements with huge consequences started to become more real and more discussed. And so I drafted the book, and the idea I had begun with to essentially take the threat of climate change and supersize it, to feel into these different speeds of the apocalypse, was already supersizing itself and continues to do so. In the last decade alone, climate change has gone from a distant abstraction to a looming and very visceral presence. And that is a very fast clip for something we think of as moving slowly, don't you think? The Light Pirate contains and is contained by one woman's lifetime. It begins just before my protagonist is born and ends in her old age. This clock spoke to me for so many reasons. Why have we been so reluctant to fully grasp and act upon the threat of climate change? Because it outpaces the human lifespan. Those of us gathered here won't be the ones who will endure the worst consequences. We will, of course, leave this grim inheritance to another generation. And so I wanted to try and see if I could bridge that lack of imagination by depicting a lifetime that holds both, the world as we know it and the world as we fear it will become. The Light Pirate takes place entirely in one town, eschewing the broader collapse that is certainly occurring in order to paint a very small and detailed portrait. It moves from the kind of town we might recognize to one we absolutely do not. The beach erodes, the municipality goes bankrupt, then the entire state, the lights go out, the daytime heat becomes so unbearable it necessitates living in the dark. When I set out to write it, I decided I would press fast forward on the effects of climate change in order to show this progression in a more manageable way, narratively speaking. But then the world went and pressed fast forward on us all. With this book, I wanted to be honest about how terrible witnessing all of this feels. I wanted to face a dismal version of the future and see if I could find something hopeful in it. I was making some remarks a few months ago at an event in Ohio, and when the moderator, hey Gilbert, asked me how I felt about where we were headed, I confessed that I am a bit of a cynic. I've thought too long and too hard about all of this to be much of an optimist. Afterward, an older woman came up to me, determined to convince me that my negative outlook on humanity's ability to course correct was all wrong. We need you to have hope, she said. And I think she meant me personally, but I think she also meant my generation. Here's the thing. I do have hope, but the kind of hope that I have is irrevocably bound to this deep, dark doom I am talking to you about. And this is the synthesis. This is what I'm able to offer you. This is what this genre can offer you. We take hope and doom and mix them together because this is the only recipe that tastes right. It's the only thing that feels honest, and this is why I think that post-apocalyptic fiction is so important to us right now. It can do both. It can be honest with you about how bad all of this is getting, and it can remind us that when everything falls apart, there is an opportunity to rebuild differently. It can show us the future we are all fearing, cut with the hope that if the world as we know it ends, then the world as we imagine it can begin. Over the course of promoting both of these books, people have often asked me how it feels to write about such things. Does it make me sad? How is my mental health? I'm glad you think that's funny. My answer is usually that there is a very real toll in the practice of looking so deeply into the narratives of destruction that are being spun. And there is a brightness in the looking. The more eyes that see, the brighter it gets. I believe that. It is so easy to feel paralyzed by how little we can do. And if that describes you, my advice is to start simply by bearing witness. And I should say this is not easy. It is not without effort. But looking is a skill that can be cultivated, and I believe it can offer comfort within the grimness. I don't spend my days wondering where this amorphous cloud of anxiety and fear has come from. We've met. We're old friends. The feeling itself is not our enemy. The feeling is the catalyst. It's the fuel. And I hope that it can also be some kind of blueprint. If we as a collective have the extraordinary power to bring an entire planet to the brink of destruction, imagine what else we can do together. Anyway, I hope that you feel better about feeling bad. And if you don't, my professional opinion as a cynic is that it would be weird if you felt completely fine while the world ended. So feel however you feel. And, if you're dissatisfied with the program, with the past 30 minutes, which were promised to be about how to feel better, then, go talk to Arlo about a refund. That's a joke because this part of the festival is free. Thank you so much for being here. It's been a real pleasure to be part of this seminar.